Welcome, people. Welcome to our team, our guests. I want to start by thanking Shelby for all the effort you put in to put this together. Thank you very much. Then I'm going to introduce the firm, and then I'm going to introduce our speakers. So I'm Gershom Margolis. Welcome, everyone. I'm the founder of Imperial Advisory, and Imperial Advisory is a fractional CFO firm. What we do is we work with businesses, typically businesses which do not have or need a full-time CFO, but still need CFO. We pick up where accounting leaves off, and we typically are working for the CEO, and we help them, CEOs and the rest of the team, make a variety of decisions, and we help with strategy, planning, financials, lots of important things. One of the things that we will sometimes get involved in, sometimes we're actually brought in just for this, and sometimes it's part of a bigger CFO role. One of those things is deal work, M&A work. And businesses need to grow, and there's a variety of ways to grow, and one of the ways to grow is to kind of buy other businesses, and there's a variety of reasons you might do that. We'll get into more of that in our conversation today. I'm going to introduce our speakers. We have three speakers here who all have a lot of interesting experience, and all of them have experience that relates to deal work, to M&A work, mergers and acquisitions. I'm going to start with Leanne, and I'm going to do a quick intro of everyone. They'll tell you all a little bit more about their background, but Leanne is a management consultant who works with companies and deals with a variety of things, including M&A, mergers and acquisitions. She kind of brought in to help deal with issues relating to transactions. I would say probably people issues, but we'll hear more from her. Ryan is I guess we can call him a recovering banker, who now spends a lot of, I'm also a recovering banker, but Ryan spends a lot of his time, in fact, his whole business, I believe, is helping businesses find good acquisition targets. And he'll tell us more about that. And then Steve is one of our amazing CFOs. We have a whole bunch of them on the team. I think you'll see their names and the words Imperial Advisory CFO. Thank you, Shelby. But Steve is one of our amazing CFOs who will be speaking with us today, part of the panel. And Steve spent much of his career at one company which grew a lot. I'm sure you'll hear more about that. And the big way that they grew, a major factor in their growth, was doing numerous acquisitions, where they basically, I would say, rolled up an industry, but we'll see how Steve describes it. And so besides for being the day-to-day CFO, Steve has a tremendous amount of experience working on transactions. And without further ado, we will get started. Thank you all, and have some fun. We're going to start by, or I'm going to start by asking asking the speakers to introduce themselves. Then we're going to talk about a few things. We'll stop for questions, then we'll go on and dig a little deeper. And then we'll take more questions at the end. So let's start with Leanne. Leanne, and really everyone, but we'll start with Leanne. Please introduce yourself and tell us how you started getting involved with deal work, with M&A.
Sure. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on wherever you are located. As Gershon said, I'm a management consultant, or the another term you can might identify is as a business architect. I focus on working with leaders and their companies to help bridge the gap between strategy and execution. And that may be in terms of whatever barriers are in their way, increasing their performance, managing change, as Gershon has mentioned. That's a lot of what I focus on. But whether you're trying to scale or exit your business, that's kind of really the areas that I focus on. I help them align their business functions, whether that's their people, process, and their technology, to whatever the goals or the strategies are of the leaders that I'm working with. And that's really to help make sure that we can make decisions and we can manage the change to achieve the goals. So if you think about it, whether someone is trying to grow and scale, they're exiting, or they've already bought or acquired or merged, there's a post-acquisition. Anywhere along that spectrum, there's going to be some commonalities that is where I get involved with. It's whether it's building and strengthening the core foundation of their business, developing the leadership, ensuring that they have a strong culture, and driving efficiency. All of that increases the value of the organization. It just depends on what the goal is of the leaders that I'm working with. So that's really, I get involved in all different aspects of what a company may be going through during its own life cycle.
Thanks, Leanne. Ryan, would you like to introduce yourself? How did you get into this business?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for having me, and good morning. Ryan Goral. I have a firm, G Spire Group, that I launched specifically to help operating companies grow through strategic mergers and acquisitions. We come in as a fractional executive. We're not a banker or a broker. And we help everything or help a company and its management team with everything that they need to effectively grow through acquisitions, from strategy to target outreach to quarterback and due diligence, capital and integration work. So we're just extra hands on deck and bringing our experience of making sure that, you know, everything is thought through in a deliberate and focused manner, and really focusing the small and lower middle market space. And that's what we do.
Thanks, Ryan. Steve, would you like to share a little bit about your story?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. So prior to joining Imperial, I was CFO for a technology company, nationwide technology company. Started many years ago, back in the 80s. And when I joined, the company was basically a startup. It was in the, like I said, technology, doing primarily renting equipment for events, conferences. And when I started, we had 3 locations. We were doing about $1 million in revenue. And we quickly saw that the quickest way to fuel our growth, in addition to trying to go organically, would be to add some acquisitions in. So we went out and we looked for companies that were doing what we did, where the owner wanted to exit the business, or some of them even wanted to stay on, but just wanted to, you know, get a liquidity event and turn some of their stock into cash. So we quickly identified companies, and in my career that we acquired over 20 companies, varying sizes, varying types of deals we did. And that fueled us to go from $1 million when I started to when I left the firm in 2020, we had got to the $100 million mark. So, you know, acquisitions, if done correctly, could really be a good way for a company to grow.
All right. Well, thank you all. All right. So let's get started. If someone was looking to sell a business, when should they start preparing? And what should they make sure to do ahead of time? Why don't we start with Ryan?
Sure. You know, I kind of advise a lot of my clients that they should always be prepping to sell in some form or fashion. You know, I think a lot of the things that you do to prep for a sale can be considered good management practices anyway. And then the other thing I see with some of my clients is you never know when you may need to sell. You know, things happen, health wise, the owner can get sick. You know, it can come up on you fast. And in those situations, maybe it's too late to do some of the really value added activities that you can do. So I feel like it should be an ongoing, always ongoing type of mind frame for the things that are necessary to add value to the business as a prep to sell. So I think it's always continuing to improve and implement things that make your business stronger.
Got it. Now, do you notice a difference when you're looking at acquisition targets? Can you tell if someone has prepared properly?
Yeah, I mean, there's some things that you can glean from, you know, the due diligence process. Clearly, you know, do they have some of their processes outlined? A lot of it is verbal. You know, if for example, if the owner 3 years prior to them going to market removed themselves from a key operating role and hired a GM or a president and has spent the last 2 or 3 years or what have you prepping that person to take over and really removing that key man risk. You can kind of see it as you go through due diligence, have discussions with that seller, and you can ask the questions, why did you do that? And well, it was a prep to sell maneuver. I want to remove the key man risk. So you can get some of that from just the active dialogue. But I think that, clean financials outlined in documented process and procedures, a clear org chart with rationale and key roles and responsibilities. Some of those good operating techniques and things that are documented, whether they were doing that for good management purposes or as a prep to sell, it's somewhat hard to identify. But as a buyer's perspective, those transactions are so much smoother and oftentimes can get more value because the due diligence is faster. You can get the answers that you need faster. You get to wrap your arms around the organization quicker. So it does speed up and add value to the transaction when you come across those targets that are, really ready to go.
Got it. Leanne, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think, just to piggyback off of what Ryan has said, is that you should always, as again, thinking about it from building of your house, your foundation needs to be strong. You should always be doing that. And I think one of the clear indications is, really around what is your leadership? What is your operating model? What is your leadership style like? And what is your culture? Because someone can pick up very quickly that your company is not operationally and leadership sound. And I think when you're looking at, it's almost like when you're meeting someone, or trying to merge two families together. That's like, I think the best analogy that I sometimes like to think about it. When you're kind of going shopping and you're meeting other people and your other families, can you merge them quickly and easily and integrate them? That I think you always have to be thinking about is really, how do you run? How are you functioning? And what are the values? The other thing, when you merge or you want to acquire somebody or you want to sell, you have to think about your people. And I think that's really where I focus. They are your assets. So do you want them? Are you buying talent? If you are, then whoever you're acquiring, you want to make sure that those individuals are happy, that they love working there. Otherwise, you're going to have to be replacing a lot of individuals. Same with the management staff. And then also to what Ryan was also saying too, is if you're really preparing, then you don't have the leadership driving the bus all the time. You know that roles are clear, and that if they were to get replaced or they have a different role, that somehow the business operations and the customers are not going to be impacted by that. So a lot of that is just making sure, I think you're doing that every day anyway is good practice, but I think you're also increasing the value when you can strengthen your operating structure and your organizational structure at the same time.
Thank you. Steve, anything?
Yeah, well, Ryan and Leanne covered most of it. So really not much to add. But one thing Ryan did say, if you're looking to bring in a new leader, let's say the CEO is looking to retire, and he said he brought somebody, his example, 3 years, which is a good time frame for somebody to learn the business. Don't hire somebody 3 months before you're willing to sell and say, oh, here's the leader, he's going to do a good job. They're going to want a track record of a management team. So, you have to watch that. And the other thing I would say, when you are looking to sell, make sure you run the business like you were running it before you were looking to sell. I remember when we were selling our business, we spent a lot of money on equipment, and our CapEx budget was, let's say it was $7 million. You can't all of a sudden decide, well, now that I'm selling, I'm not going to spend the money, because why would I do that? Let me save the money. Buyer will quickly realize, hey, you're not investing in the business anymore, and that will become an issue in due diligence. So you really want to make sure you continue to run the business. If it's been successful, keep doing what you've been doing to be successful, and don't try to change things to try to get cute on the buyer to try to get a couple more bucks, because that will come out in due diligence and they will make an adjustment.
Got it. Now, will they just make an adjustment, or do you end up losing for pulling stunts like that? Does a seller end up losing?
It may not kill the deal, but certainly they would say, you should have spent X, you spent Y, so we're going to make believe you spent it, and then we're going to make an adjustment. It shouldn't kill the deal, but it's really not in good faith, and again, it's just going to leave a sour taste.
Got it. I imagine for things other than equipment, sometimes if not investing in things helps things get ruined as well. So like equipment, you can always just buy more later. But if you haven't taken care of your equipment, let's say, and then they'll all end up breaking down sooner, it could end up being more expensive in the long run, not just catch up.
True.
Yeah, I mean, I think whether it's physical equipment, but it's also you're going to want to be able to present because you're the target, so you want the most value, right? So you're also going to want to present that you've also streamlined your operations. So I think sometimes a lot of people say, well, I'm not going to invest in automating something, maybe to Steve's point, and say, I'm going to put this off. But I think as someone who's looking at a company and buying, you want to know that their data and their systems, that it's accurate and that it's predictable. And because I think that also is an indication of how this company is managed and how decisions are made. So I think that's another piece where I sometimes find people want to hold off on investments. It's just also even improving the software and the automation that they need to make.
Well, and on that point, and this is in Leanne's world, but it's a little harder to pencil. From a buyer's perspective, do you really want to buy a company that's, on the human capital side that's been redlining their employees for the last 3 years, and there have been at or more capacity and just driven into the ground because the owner was trying to, or the seller was trying to, pull out as much cash flow out of the business as possible? Well, that buyer is going to come in and all of a sudden there's going to be an attrition problem because, think about it from an employee's perspective. If they're burnt out and then there's a change of ownership, I mean, you can just imagine the barriers and the things that a buyer would have to do. So you can think about the human capital. I don't like using that term necessarily, but just like the capital expenditures and the equipment, if you've got deferred maintenance, you've been running the stuff in the ground and you haven't been properly maintaining that asset, there's going to be adverse effects going forward. So I think it does apply to kind of the human resources and employee base as well.
Yeah, that's what I was, indicating too, is that, people are your assets. And as we all know now, talent is hard to replace. And I think that's kind of really what you need to be thinking about. And that's why I said, you can tell during the due diligence process what the culture of the organization is like. And if their people are, to Ryan's point, are they burnt out? Are they overworked? You can immediately start to pick up on indications of that without doing a formal assessment. And that should be of concern, because if people are burnt out or their roles are not clear, then if you're acquiring that organization and you wanted that talent, you're going to have to really seriously think, how many of them may leave? And that is a risk that you're going to have to consider when actually looking at an organization, or even from the post perspective. What areas are you going to have to shore up, especially on the talent side?
Well, I think that's a perfect segue into our next question, because our next question is about what is the right reason to do a deal. And depending on the reason to do a deal, maybe you don't care if the people leave. If you're buying it for technology, let's say, people might potentially be less of an issue. But I guess we'll hear from our panelists. So this is for Steve and Leanne. So Steve, what's the right reason to do a deal?
Well, it all depends on, if you're looking about selling the business, it all depends on the owner's objectives. Does the owner want to retire? Does he want to exit the business? Does he just want a liquidity event? And does he want to stay on? And I know we'll touch on another question, and based upon that, what type of buyer should the seller look for? But it really depends on the owner's objectives. Maybe he has family members that he wants to bring up into the business, and he wants to exit and just wants a partner that could continue to grow with the family. So lots of reasons why, somebody would want to sell.
Got it. Leanne, were there?
Yeah, I think it's not around what is the right reason. I think it's really around what are your reasons. And you need to be incredibly crystal clear as to what is the rationale for what you're wanting to do, whether you're trying to acquire or you're wanting to sell. It doesn't really matter. You need to be clear, because that degree of clarity really drives everything when you're even thinking about who you may want to partner with, regardless of what side you're on, all the way through to post integration and even a year or so after the deal is done, because that rationale drives your compelling reason for wanting to do what you want to do, and that drives how you're going to communicate, how you're going to market and brand, exactly how these two entities are going to come together. And that has a huge effect, as we were just talking about, on talent. Because if they don't really understand on both sides why this is happening and what that means for them and the role that they're going to be playing, then you're going to have performance issues and talent issues as things keep moving forward. So I think from a rationale perspective, if you are, again, looking for innovation, they may be working on a totally different operating style. They may be less rigorous. They may, because they may be more creative, they may not have the metrics that, let's say, if you're a very cost-effective and very operationally efficient organization, you're kind of merging two entities that don't seem like they would go together. But I think, again, the rationale says we need to put these two together. So then how do we do that? And how do we make sure that the two operating models and the cultures work together? And that's why I said the rationale has to be very clear. And once that's clear, you can then determine how you want, who you're looking for, and then how you're going to try to integrate them together in a successful way.
Thank you. Thank you, Leanne. Okay, back to Steve. What type of buyer should a seller seek out? Whether financial, strategic, turnaround, something else?
Again, that all depends on what the owner objectives are. So let's say the owner is looking to sell, wants to exit the business, wants to retire, just wants to cash out. Then I would think a strategic buyer would be best alternative, because they will probably, they know the business, they know the industry. They probably don't need them to stick around too long, because they, like I said, they'll have him stick around during a transition, but then he could exit. And usually, if there is a strategic buyer involved, the price is usually higher. And the reason for that is just simple math. If you're a strategic buyer and you're in the same business, you're going to be able to get synergies. You probably have people doing the same job, and you could eliminate, particularly in the back office, eliminate people, and you'll get synergies, which will increase the value of the deal. Now, if you know, a lot of owners are looking, and the example when we sold the company I was with, the owner was looking to, all his wealth was in the stock of the company, and he wanted to diversify and take some of that stock and turn it into cash. But he wanted to continue on with the business. He was, a young man. 55 to me is very young now when you're in your 60s. So he wanted to continue on with the business, but wanted, like I said, get a liquidity event. So we were looking for a financial buyer who wanted to just take what we were doing, continue with the management team, and continue to grow the business. Now we would have more resources because the private equity firm has deep pockets. They're willing to invest more than we could, come up with, and more than what the owner wanted to invest himself. He didn't want to continue to put more money into the business. He wanted a private equity firm to do that. So we were looking for a financial buyer. And in fact, we had multiple offers. One of the offers was from a strategic buyer who was willing to pay millions of dollars more than the highest financial offer. And the CEO, the owner, said, you know what, I'm not ready to retire. I'm getting a nice payout. So if I have to take $5 million less to be able to continue to run my business and grow it, that's what we'll do. So we turned down an offer for more money from a strategic because he wanted to continue on with the business. And the buyer just said, okay, we want to keep the management team. Everybody's in place. We're just going to ask you to reinvest some of your proceeds from the sale into the business to show you're committed. And we'll continue doing what you're doing, but now you'll have more resources to grow the business. So again, it all depends on the owner objectives and whether you want to look for strategic, financial, again, depending on what the owner wants to do.
Thanks. All right. Any questions from the audience? All right. So let's move on to the next part. Ryan, this one's for you. I think maybe Steve will follow up. But we'll start with Ryan. What culture issues would scare you away? You're out there scouting a business, you find the perfect business in every way except for culture. What does that look like, and What do you do?
Yeah, culture's it's one of those kind of pillars that you want to make sure you have right. You know, it can be, not always, but it can be a tough thing to nail down to as a buyer. It just depends on how open the seller is and what kind of view you have in due diligence on kind of what the culture is. I think with active listening, having some partners, having active discussions with the seller, with very active listening, you can hear things that will suggest what the culture is like, maybe what the core values are like. Just because it's on the wall doesn't mean that's how they live through those core values. So it's very thoughtful questions, and active listening is kind of how you get to it. The things that you would, every client I work with, every buyer is going to want to hear certain things. So red flags will depend on the buyer. Obviously, probably for most buyers, the biggest ones are any unethical, immoral type of stuff that has happened within the business. That would be a huge red flag. Those are kind of easy, I guess, to identify. The harder ones, the more nuanced culture red flags, are when the buyer's core values and culture are very different than the target company. And if there is, so I'll use an example. So let's say you are a big company, and your customer base is Fortune 500 companies, and that's who you're used to selling to. It's who you're used to serving. And then you go buy a company who is a scrappy entrepreneurial company who serves scrappy small businesses and entrepreneurs. They wear jeans to work. They're just a different culture, where your client, the buyer, maybe, it's suit and tie. They have to do these big proposals. Everything's structured. There's 3 layers of management for approvals. So I just use that as an example. I don't know how good that is, but if you're going to go buy a company that has a completely different way of doing business, totally different culture, process and procedures, and even customer base that you're serving, to me, it's not necessarily a hard stop, but it would definitely be a hard pause to make sure this is the type of company that it's going to, we have a plan to acclimate, but big core values or big culture differences is usually a big pause for me, for something to discuss. And oftentimes it should, it can kill a deal, and oftentimes it should, because cultures meshing together is an important component to making a successful deal work.
Got it. Now, are there issues that would, you were talking now, at the beginning you were talking about ethical issues, and then you were saying culture clashes. Are there like problems that you've noticed, or not necessarily? Meaning not just a clash, like this is a real problem besides for ethical things, like the way that people interact with each other, like that's just, I don't know, what do they call it? Radioactive. Like we don't want to be near that. Not just that we don't want to merge this company. I would never want any company to have that, or that you don't notice that level of stuff when you're.
I think it's more alignment. So if you have a cutthroat culture and it's all about sales and this is how we work and this is how we're successful, and everyone that signs up to that culture is cutthroat sales, go win, even if it means climbing over my own my own teammates. If that's the culture that you've built, I'm not saying that's the right culture, but let's say that's the DNA of the company that's doing the buying. You come across a target that has a similar culture, it may not be what you and I would go, oh, that looks like a pleasant culture, but it is what it is. And if it aligns, it aligns. So I think that it really comes down to alignment, and making sure that, there's self-awareness on the buyer's perspective of what it is, what is our culture, what are our values, and then making sure you flush it out with the target. And I think it's more about alignment than anything specific as it relates to the culture itself.
Got it. Okay, I hear that. Steve, as a buyer, what's your take on all this?
Well, yeah, well, Ryan said it well. I mean, culture is so important. Are they aligned with you? And the example he gave was excellent. If you're a cutthroat company and they're very passive, the cultures may not mix. And culture is, when you do a deal, it's very easy to look at the quantitative stuff. What's their EBITDA? And you could audit that. You could verify that. You could look at add backs, everything. You could say, okay, this I can get very comfortable with. Culture is one of the nebulous things that it's really more a feeling. And when you talk to people, will the cultures mesh? But one of the couple of things you could look at quantitatively, and it's not so much on culture, but you could look at things like turnover statistics for your employees. I mean, are they constantly churning employees over? Are they leaving? Well, if that's the case, why are they doing it? Why are they leaving? Are they constantly churning customers? Maybe they're pissing customers off with their attitude or their whatever they're doing. So those are things you could do that'll not so much on culture, but really how are the employees and how are they treating their customers that you can you can quantify. The other thing we've done in the past is if you've ever used Glassdoor, if you look at Glassdoor, you'll get reviews from employees about the company, and companies and employees are not shy to share their views. So if you look at Glassdoor and there are 20 reviews and the employees are saying, oh, I went to work there, they told me I was going to get this, and they reneged on their promise. It's a horrible place to work. That's an excellent way to look and say, what are the employees saying about the company? Because obviously, when you're meeting with the seller, they're going to paint a rosy picture. Everybody loves it here. We're a great place to work. But look at turnover. Look at places like Glassdoor, and you'll get maybe get under the covers of what's really going on at the company.
Got it. Leanne, anything to add?
Yeah, the couple things I was just to say is one is I think what you need to do first is actually even understand and culture is just something that's not very well understood, right? But first you need to look inward and say, what is the culture of my organization? And so to what Ryan is saying, Steve is saying, how do I figure out what the alignment is? You got to figure out who you are first as a company. And that is really what are your behaviors and the expectations that drive how we function. And so again, it gets also to the cornerstone of your own identity as an organization. So I think a couple things you can look at, and to what I think was already said, you can kind of pick up on things even just in brief conversations, as I was saying, even as you're trying to think about or shop or go through the whole due diligence process. But a couple of things to think about is one is around leadership and management style. Maybe how much do they collaborate? What kind of teamwork do they have inside of their organization? What is your communication style? You can even tell if it's more formal or there's a high degree of formality. So it's informal or formal. Things like that you can pick up on just by working with them. The other thing too is how much are they adaptable? And those are just things as you're talking to them, you can pick up on. Also, do they always need to run things by someone else in order to give you an answer? That also then you can pick up on what is the degree of autonomy and decision-making that various levels have. There are very little things you can pick up on just as you're talking to somebody. You can kind of tell, do I need to run and ask somebody this, or I'll come back to you with that information. That means then that they don't have things readily available. Also, some of the things that Steve talked about is, okay, you look at their talent, but you could also look at how they execute. From a customer's perspective, are they delivering? What is their success? Because that also then says, do I have a tight operations and tight processes in terms of how we execute and what are the metrics that we measure our business on? So I think those are things, again, it depends on who you are and what are you looking for. If you were looking for someone and you're buying their creativity, their innovation, again, that's not a bad thing. It's just to know that they're different. And then the work that has to get done is, how do we figure out how to make both work? Maybe the creative and innovative side is what you want. they may need to have a little bit more rigor, but you can't apply, if you're very rigorous in your operations and your metrics, you can't apply that to them, because otherwise you are now not really getting the value of what you're really looking for when you wanted to acquire that other entity. So I think one, look at who you are yourself, so then you can think about these kind of categories that I'd mentioned, and then kind of put on a scale. Where do you think this other organization fits, and how can you make it work if that's really an entity that you want to acquire? But those are just maybe some aspects that I would look for, but nothing that you could say run for the hills, unless there's obviously things where things won't align and they don't make sense. But I think a lot of it is trying to understand the other side before it gets too far.
Got it. I think we kind of covered the next question, which is what are important talent issues to address during due diligence? Anyone have anything they want to add on that?
It does. I was going to add one more thing to that last topic, but this is perfect. So one of the things that I think when you think about culture from a buyer's perspective, as a seller, what some things that might be beneficial to think about as it relates to talent is you kind of think about what most employees, us as human beings, are looking for. We want to get paid well. We want to be empowered, and we want growth opportunities. And you can kind of distill some of this out in the financials. You can kind of distill some of this out in the benefits packages. You definitely could distill this out with some of the conversation of how the seller talks about his or her employees. But so I think when you ask, and Leanne said this, when you ask them to kind of walk you through the process of how decisions are made, is a great question. And maybe as a seller, something you should be thinking about. Is the decision always up to me and I don't take their input? Well, that might be something to consider. Are your process and procedures set up for your employees to make decisions and be empowered? Are there incentives, compensation, or otherwise aligned with the goals of the organization? Those things say a ton about the culture of the business, just peeling back just a couple of those layers. So I think that relates to your talent, question.
It's also how people communicate. And to Ryan's point, I think when you're even talking to, a prospective target, or even just in any of these meetings, you can really, how people feel, it comes out in their presence, and you can really kind of pick up a lot. So I think one of you said earlier is just to really picking up, and one, it's asking questions, open-ended questions, but it's also picking up on other cues. And a lot of those are informal cues, and listening to the language in which people are using as they're trying to communicate things about their business. Simple one could also be, do they even really understand the mission and the brand of their business? Those are some things that quickly come through too, is that maybe really people don't understand what it is that they're doing and why it's important. But those are things you can pick up on, because then you can, to Ryan's point, I think things are told too much at the top. Things are not really trickled all the way through. And I think, again, that could be something that could impact if everything is held at the top and senior levels and things are not throughout the organization, and you're looking, maybe not all of that senior level stays, or it depends on what their role is moving forward. Those are things you're going to have to really kind of consider when it comes to that. But I think the question is, will I have a job? That's what everyone's going to ask. They're going to get wind of what's going on. They're going to want to know, what does this mean for me? And what is my new role? Or even, do I have a role? So I think you have to work all of those things out before you can start communicating, and you don't want those things to accidentally trickle out, because that can cause a lot of people who are not fully aware of what's going on to start looking to go elsewhere. And then you're just going to have people leaving. So I think you have to plan out the change, the communication, and your org structure very early on, and know that that's kind of ironed out before things kind of get too far down the road. And then the other thing I would suggest is setting up a group inside that's maybe combined the two entities together that deals with all talent issues. Therefore, it's coming out of one group. One group is assessing who's staying and who's going, but also it's also communication. So therefore, it's not confusing. But that would be another thing if you're kind of further moving forward in that deal, is to something else to set up.
Something that I believe I heard from one of our CFOs, a former CFO and partner here at Imperial, Bob Doyle, was, I believe he said that when they would do acquisitions, they would pay stay bonuses to some of the key executives so that they would basically know that those people will be around for at least X amount of time. And that would give everyone enough time to kind of do the evaluation that you're talking about, Leanne. So if someone, we know they're going to get wind, they're going to be part of an acquisition, tell them, hey, listen, we're guaranteeing you your salary for all 2023. And by mid-year, we'll figure it all out. So you don't have to jump ship now when you find a job. You don't have to start looking now. And, and then, we can figure it all out as Leanne described, but kind of putting an insurance policy in there as well.
Well, the only thing I would say, Gershon, you're not going to guarantee you're not going to guarantee a salary. You're going to say, if you stay a year from now, you're going to get a bonus of X, because you never want to. In 3 months, you may say this guy is not producing, he doesn't want to be here, I'm going to let him go. So, but the people that you want to stay, that's usually doesn't happen, but the people you want to stay, you're going to give them some type of bonus just for staying,
Got it. Okay.
There may also be a case too where, there'd be maybe individuals that you want to stay, but also maybe there are individuals that are key to the integration. And you may want to secure some type of compensation that they just stay for a short period of time through the integration, because they're essential. And I think, again, when understanding your talent, you need to really understand all levels. Just because someone has a job title doesn't mean they know really what's going on, and they know really how that business functions. So I think you really almost have to kind of look at the talent from an objective perspective, and then determine if this is an individual that is going to be very essential in the integration, then yes, then maybe there's a short-term incentive that, and a lot of that again is thinking about what's the rationale and what it is that you're trying to drive towards. And if there are key personnel that you need to keep, then obviously they're in the know a little bit earlier on than the rest of the individuals. But I think once it gets to talent and evaluating the rest of the pool of individuals, you need to be very transparent about what the process is and what the methodology is in terms of, do I even need to interview for the job that I currently have? Does everyone need to interview at the same job level? That's a lot of the job leveling that has to get done in terms of integrating talent, figuring out how they're getting paid, what their titles are, and who's going to be doing what. Again, it gets back to determining that org structure early on.
All right.
Gershon, one other thing on that is, I think from a seller's perspective, I know that I think there's, the pitfalls of a sale. I think a lot of the sellers we talk to, they're really concerned about their employees. Is the buyer going to take care of my customers and my employees is very oftentimes a discussion point. If you're a seller, you're thinking about selling your company, and you're concerned about your employees, I think one of the best things you can do is start elevating their roles and responsibilities within the organization as you prep to sell. Make them a key part of the organization prior to you actually selling. So when you get into a negotiation with the buyer starts doing due diligence, you can point to these key employees and how important they are. And then they're likely to be included in the state packages and et cetera, et cetera. So one thing you can do to take care of your employees is, include them and make them valuable parts of the organization as you kind of prep to sell. And I think that's, that would be just a good best practice if you're thinking about prepping to sell.
Well, we're doing really good with segues today, because my next question is, if someone has a family business and they have their kids in the business and they're looking to sell the business, but they want their kids to stay employed, besides for what you recommended, Ryan, what other tips do we have for a seller? Or is there anything that you can do to help protect your kids?
That's a tricky one. I mean, I think what I just outlined would be one thing, make them key employees to where they, a buyer would want them to stay. That was one way to protect them. If they're some middle management, they don't have any equity, they don't have really any key roles, responsibilities, and decision making, outside of selling the business to them as a way to protect them. A buyer's, they're gonna do what they think is best for the business coming in. So it's hard to actually protect them in a way that's, enforceable and legally enforceable, I should say. But if you have family members and, it comes down to, are they just on the payroll and that's just a benefit of the business? Or are they actually key? Do they have key roles within the business? And it's what's their interest level in staying on once you leave? I mean, if it's a family run business. So I think there's a lot of self-reflection, having those key discussions with your family members prior to going to market, understanding where their interests lie. You may not need to protect them. Maybe their answers would be, mom and dad, if you sell this, I don't want to be a part of this thing. I want to do it because of the family. So having those discussions are important. And if they want to stay on, I think elevating them, making them super key people where they can't be easily replaced would be a way to secure them for at least a period of time.
Yeah, I just want to chime in. As Ryan said, that's the best way is to make them key parts that the buyer wants to keep them on because they know their business will be more successful keeping them on. I mean, you can ask the buyer, say, these are the family members and I'm concerned about them and you need to give them an employee contract for X period of time. Now, I know as a buyer, you really don't want to do that, but it depends on, how much they want the deal and they may be willing to do that for a period of time. Again, that will only protect them for a period of time. They're not going to give them a lifetime employment contract. It's only going to be for a set period of time. So when that expires, if they don't think they're key, they're going to let them go. So again, it goes back to what Ryan said, make them key members of the business and they'll want to keep them.
I think the other thing too is it's all part of your succession plan. I mean, you should be thinking about this well in advance and preparing. So if you are bringing in your family members into the business, do they also earn the role that they're in? I mean, you can give them and may say, this is a key individual based on their title. But again, I think to do them also service, if you want them to be part of the business going forward, is to make sure that their role is really clear and they're actually performing in the business function that you've asked for them and that they earn it. Think about it from another perspective. If I were on the other side and I saw X person in this role, you can really tell if that person is really running and really knows what they're doing, or they just placed in a role and this is their title. So again, roles, responsibilities, do they have the leadership that you're looking for if you're wanting to acquire them? So I think a lot of that is set that person up for success well in advance. That should be part of your succession plan, but that person should really know what they're doing and that comes through. So it's hard and that makes them a key essential person. It's not just the job title, I think is what I wanted to emphasize, is important.
Thank you all. Let's see. We have a few more questions. I don't know if why don't we see if we have questions from the audience? Because usually we try to end off with that. People, thank you all for joining. Anyone have any questions for our amazing panel today? You can drop them in the chat or just jump in. Okay. You're welcome, Ezra. Thank you for joining. We have one thank you. Okay. Well, if you do have questions, drop them in. We can still read some of those out or just jump in. So let's continue. We have a couple more and then we have a quick little survey and then we'll wind down in 3 or 4 minutes. And I'll probably put the survey up in a minute. Okay. So if a buyer wants to stay on for a period of time after the sale, how long? That is correct. If the buyer wants the seller to stay on, let me rephrase that. Thanks, Steve. If the buyer wants the seller to stay on, how long is it reasonable to expect the seller to stay on? And if the seller is staying on, are they an employee? Are they a consultant? How does all that work?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I think I think the clear answer is it depends. What stage that seller is in his or her life cycle of the business. Their interest in staying versus heading to the beach. What is it exactly does the buyer need, and how long does it take to transfer that knowledge? All things that are, I think case by case dependent. In a lot of the smaller businesses I work in, SBA financing can be part of those transactions. And the SBA sometimes has a rule. Well, they have rules that somewhat dictate some of those questions, Gershon. So for example, a seller, when an SBA loan is used to acquire a business, the SBA mandates that the seller is out within 12 months. And they can only stay on in a 1099 capacity for offering transition services, as an example. So not all transactions.
That's the same thing. To clarify, they can stay on for 12 months in a 1099 capacity, or after 12 months, it needs to be 1099.
No, they can only stay on for 12 months per the SBA rules.
And those 12 months are 1099.
Yes, that's correct.
It's shocking that the federal government would let you stay on as a 1099.
I don't think all the government agencies are aligned with some of the rules that they set, but that's a different topic. but yeah, so for example, so the SBA will dictate some of that if that's part of the transaction. A lot of transactions don't have it SBA as part of it, so it's a kind of moot point, but I thought I'd bring that up as an interesting kind of data point for some of the smaller transactions that occur for a seller. And then, for more, traditional buyouts, again, it goes back to, it depends on, from a buyer's perspective, it's not always advantageous to have the seller around in some situations. In some situations, you want them as long as you can have them be productive. So I think it's really just depends on the situation.
Okay, thank you. We have one question from the audience. Ezra asked, how much typical debt to revenue ratio are you finding these days for companies generating 2 to 10 million in sales? That feels like another Ryan question.
I'd have to go do the math. Usually I'm looking at a debt to cash flow ratio and not a debt to EBITDA. Usually senior debt, they want kind of max senior debt at 2.5 to 3 ratio between senior debt and the cash flow of the business. And that's an adjusted cash flow metric. I couldn't speak to the revenue multiple, but a ratio, but I think the cash flow multiple, from what I'm hearing in the market, senior leverage is at that 2.5 to 3 times max for these types of transactions.
And does that change? Does that change as interest rates change? Because carrying 2.5 times cash flow becomes a lot more expensive at 7% than at 3.5%.
Yeah, I mean, a lot goes into that bucket. So you have, the interest expense, which impacts cash flow. That'll be clearly a part of it. Increased interest rates, producing a recession environment, which creates banks being a little bit more cautious in their lending appetite. which then leads them to want lower ratios, is probably more of an impact on what the bank's willing to do from a leverage perspective than just the interest rate in a silo. But it definitely is part of it, and from what I've been seeing in the market.
Got it. Okay. All right, we got 3 minutes left. So I want to remind everyone we have the survey. If you can figure it out, if you can fill it out, it's like 3 questions. That's helpful. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to everyone who joined. Thank you, Ezra, for the questions. Thank you to our amazing panel. If you'd like to speak with any of them, you can probably find them yourselves, but you can definitely reach out to us and we'll put you in touch. Best to reach out to Shelby. And yeah, if you need us, you need a CFO, you need help with your next acquisition, or you're looking to sell in a couple of years, obviously you know where to find us. Thank you all. Any final comments, or we'll just say goodbye? Steve, Leanne, anything you want to add, or Ryan, but you were just talking. So.
I appreciate you having me. This was fun. Thanks for the discussion, and I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. We enjoyed having you.
Yeah, and hopefully if there's just maybe just a few little nuggets or food for thought as you're kind of thinking through just sort of the trajectory of your business and the life cycle. So hopefully we provided just a few little helpful hints.
Thank you. Thanks,
And
Leanne.
Ryan, I will say, I learned something. I never realized the SBA had requirements when they lend them money on an acquisition. I would think it would be the other thing. They want them to stay longer till the transition goes well, but go figure.
Oh, and they pushed 1099s.
Well,
which
that
is
I can
crazy.
see. They get double FICA, so they probably do better.
Yeah, but the government is always, isn't the government always against? I always thought the federal government was against 1099s and always trying to reclassify everyone as employees. So that was the vibe I've gotten from employment people. Anyway, Ryan says that's another topic.
That's a whole other topic. I think my departing thought is it's less about, I think, the tax and the financial piece. It's more the SBA doesn't want that seller, they're really more concerned about sellers getting 2 bites of the apple or having multiple benefits on the back of its government-backed program than anything. I think that was the why behind those rules, whether they make sense or not, which I would argue that there's a lot of situations that it doesn't make sense. But I think that's where they were coming from.
Got it. All right. We have someone who texted me directly to say thanks very much and to thank our excellent speakers, and Shelby, thank you as well for helping put this whole thing together. All right, it's 12 o'clock. We try to end on time. Thank you all. It was great seeing everyone today.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining, and thank you, Leanne and Ryan, for joining as speakers.
Thank you. Everyone have a great day.
You too. Thanks.